Hi everyone. This training is on reinforcement. So, reinforcement is a really common term in the field of ABA, which you've probably heard. It's a really common principle that we use to look to increase socially significant behaviors. So when you see us writing a report and identifying goals and specific targets that we're going to be teaching. Those are all taught utilizing principles of reinforcement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is, and also how to set up opportunities for you to use reinforcement effectively at home, and also to determine the effectiveness. So whether or not it's working. It seems like an arbitrary principle. Some people have their oppositions to it, but to me, that just means that it's implemented incorrectly, or there's a misconception about what it is. Because once we talk more, I'll provide some examples, and the examples really demonstrate that we use reinforcement all the time, whether or not we're strategically implementing it or not. So I'll talk about a little bit what that looks like as well. So first I want to talk a little bit about what reinforcement is. So reinforcement is a principle that we look at, like I said, identifying a specific behavior, and we are either presenting a reinforcer or removing an aversive stimulus, and that results in an increased frequency of that behavior. So the key term I want to point out here is increasing the behavior. So there's a difference between having a preferred item and something that's a reinforcer. So they may seem like the same thing, like I like bubbles, for example. Bubbles is a preferred item because I really like it. But is it a reinforcer? Is it not? The true indicator of whether or not something is a preferred item versus a reinforcer is whether or not it actually increases the behavior that we're trying to see more of. So you've heard me use the term reinforcer as well. So there's reinforcer and reinforcement. Reinforcer is the actual item that increases behavior. So like I said in that example, bubbles would be the reinforcer. And then reinforcement is the actual like ABC. We talked in the past about antecedent behavior consequence. That's the actual contingency that we're looking at to determine whether or not behavior is increasing. Some examples of primary reinforcers, we call them, are these are things that are necessary for survival. So these are things like air, water, and food that are naturally embedded into our everyday life. And then there's secondary reinforcers. We also call them arbitrary reinforcers. Those are things like toys, books, candy, things like that we utilize in hopes that then transfers to more naturalistic type reinforcements. There are two different components of reinforcement. So there's positive and there's negative reinforcement. The misconception here is that negative reinforcement is bad or is punishment. It is not. So here again, we talked about the key word of increasing behavior. So reinforcement serves to increase a behavior that we want to see more of. So with positive reinforcer, that is adding a preferred item. So for example, I provide bubbles every time that you clap your hands when I said clap hands. A negative reinforcer is removing something negative or aversive to a person. So if you smell something really smelly, you close a window to remove that smell, and that increases the likelihood that I'm going to close the window again to remove the smell. So to kind of break down the contingency a little bit more for you, the antecedent is that, say, I smell a skunk. the behavior is that I close the window, and the consequence is that the skunk smell is removed or eliminated. So you can see in the antecedent condition there, the smell of the skunk was aversive to me, and I removed the aversive situation. But to kind of contradict the misconception here, it ends in a preferred outcome. So it's going to increase my behavior of closing the window again in the future to remove that aversive situation. So that in turn is not a punishment contingency or has a negative outcome. The negative word really just means removal of something aversive. And then positive means that we're adding something preferred. So that's the main difference between the two of those. I have a lot of examples here for you of reinforcement. An example is that a child doesn't have a food item. The child says, "Can I have the food item?" So a cookie, and then the child gets access to a cookie. So that's an example of positive reinforcement because we gave a preferred item to the child contingent upon them asking, and it's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to ask again in the future. Another example of how it may increase undesired behavior is your child doesn't have attention, they cry, and then you provide attention to them. So you say, "Hey, what do you need?" That's an example of providing attention, and that may inadvertently increase the child's behavior of crying because it got them access to your attention. Some examples of Actually, let me give you some more examples of positive reinforcement before I go into negative reinforcement. A common example for us is getting paychecks. So getting paid for working is reinforcing our behavior of going to work and going to work on time. A dog gets a dog treat for when you call his name, so that increases the likelihood that they're going to come when their name is called. The child gets dessert for eating all their vegetables, so that's probably a very common one for you at home. I myself have said it several times. If you eat all your green beans, you can have ice cream after, and it works for us. A child gets a trophy for winning football season at the end of the season. Another example of positive reinforcement. Child's crying and the 2-year-old gets picked up because they're crying. That's an example of positive reinforcement because you're presenting mom or dad. The child yells in the candy store and gets access to candy. Another example of positive reinforcement. And another common example is praise for doing things that you want to see. So I asked my 2-year-old to throw this in the garbage, and I said, "Yeah, good job throwing this away," and give him a high five. And that is positive reinforcement because I'm adding a social reinforcer to contingent on the behavior that he engaged in. So those are all examples of positive reinforcement. So in all of those scenarios, I was adding a preferred item, and then in turn increases the behavior that we are looking to increase, or inadvertently reinforcing without knowing. That's also common. So in turn, negative reinforcement, like I said, is removing an aversive stimulus. So again, the end result of all of these are that it increases the likelihood that we're going to remove that stimulus again in the future. Common example is when your alarm clock goes off in the morning. I guess not really alarm clock anymore. Your timer or your alarm on your phone. I'm sure most people set their phones at this point. But when you press that snooze button, that's an example of negative reinforcement because it removes the aversive sound of your timer. So our contingency looks like in the antecedent, our alarm clock or timer is going off on our phone. Our behavior is that we either press the snooze button or we press the off button. And then the consequence is that we no longer hear that aversive stimulus of the alarm clock. So that's an example of negative reinforcement because we're removing an aversive situation. Another example is if you have a newborn and your newborn's crying, that's an aversive sound, especially to a mom's ears. So your instincts are to feed the baby or, figure out what it is. Maybe they pooped. So in the example of feeding, our situation would be that we hear the baby crying, we feed the baby, and then we no longer hear the baby crying. So that's going to increase the likelihood that when we hear crying in the future, that we're going to our first instinct is going to be to feed them or change them or whatever our instincts are telling us at the time. Some other examples are you're riding a horse and it's going too fast and you pull the reins and it quickly and it slows the reins down. So you're moving an aversive situation of your horse is potentially running out of control to the point where you don't feel comfortable. Another example is your seatbelt noise in your car. Your seatbelt alarm thing is going off. You put on your seatbelt and the aversive seatbelt sound is removed. Another example is you're washing dishes and the water gets really hot, so you put on gloves. That removes the feeling of hotness on your hands. Another example is you're feeling like you're getting sunburnt outside, so you put on some sunscreen, and that removes that feeling that you're getting sunburnt. Those are all just common examples of situations. I also talked about the window example, how when you smell something, you close the window and you no longer smell something. Another example is just the opposite. You're cooking dinner. This is actually a regular occurrence at my house. You're cooking dinner, things start to smoke a little bit, your fire alarm's going off, so you open the window, and it removes the smoke and it removes the smoke alarm going off in your house. That's another example of negative reinforcement. So I think you kind of got the gist. Those are just, like I said, some everyday examples of things that you encounter on a regular basis without somebody delivering a piece of candy contingent on everything cool that you do. And like I said, I think that's a common misconception that reinforcement is just giving praise or tangibles or edibles contingent on doing something, which, yes, that's typically a starting point for us when we're teaching, but it's not the end all be all of what reinforcement truly is. So in teaching, now that you kind of have a better understanding about the difference between the two, how we utilize reinforcement during teaching, I'll kind of talk a little bit about. So one big thing that we do is called a preference assessment. And a preference assessment is basically establishing what some potential reinforcers are that you could use for teaching. This is important because, like I use the bubble example in the beginning of this talk, because I might really like bubbles, but it might not be reinforcing enough to increase our behavior. So that's something that we want to take into consideration when we're teaching and something that we're always constantly reevaluating. The first thing I'm going to say when a child is plateauing or is stuck on a specific skill, the first question I always ask the tech is, well, what's the reinforcer that you're using and is it valuable enough? So in another talk, the one about motivating operations, we talked about how manipulating the value of the reinforcer is also pertinent. But this is truly how we look at choosing reinforcers. So our first step is to determine what are some things that your child likes. And we always ask that in our intake information sheet that you guys have to fill out. And that's why we ask that, is because we want to kind of flourish the environment with those things that are preferred, and kind of gauge what are some things that we can use as reinforcers. If you say that your child likes bubbles, swings, and cars, we're going to have bubbles, swings, and cars on our evaluation. However, sometimes we're noticing upon presentation of those things, they might not be interested because of, now we're asking them to do things in order to earn these things, but they're not increasing behavior. So that's kind of our job to determine what are those things that we can utilize, excuse me, to help increase behavior that we want to see more of. So once we kind of have, we call it a reinforcer inventory, we have, 50 different things that your child likes. Then when we're actually teaching a skill, we do what we call a preference assessment. So of those 50 things, we're going to narrow it down to determine which ones specifically are increasing behavior. So maybe I'm about to do a teaching trial of instruction following, and we want to determine what the child is going to earn. And at the end of that, we may present 3 items to them and figure out what's motivating in that time. Because your child might really like bubbles in the beginning of the day, but maybe in this moment they're just not feeling bubbles. So this kind of gets us a picture of what that looks like for your child. Preference assessments look different for everyone. If you have a child who's able to answer the question, what do you want to work for? Then we would just ask and let the child choose. Sometimes that's overwhelming. So sometimes we might provide 3 choices to kind of narrow it down of things that we know that they like. We might have a child utilize a choice board or a PEX board to use a visual representation of things that they can choose to work for. Or the simplest way to do this is to actually grab the items and have them laid out in front of your child for them to just reach for whatever it is that they want. Once they reach, we allow them to have access for it a little bit for a few seconds, and then we remove the item. So that's basically how we the steps that we take to establish a reinforcer for our teaching trials. If you're struggling to find things that are reinforcing or valuable to your child, there's research out there and there's examples of reinforcement inventories that if you need assistance or guidance, you can reach out to me and I can provide those to you. Or a simple Google search, you're able to find. There's a lot out there that are free and accessible to families to utilize. When we are doing this inventory in the clinic, we look at several different areas. There's an acronym SEATS, and that helps us individualize into different types of reinforcers. So the first S in SEATS is social. So we test all of these things. Some kids love tickles, some don't. So those social reinforcers are one of the big things that we test and one of the most natural too. So like a high five, a praise, a pat on the back, a hug. Those are all examples of things that are social reinforcers and the most naturally reinforcing. So that's one of the things that we test. The E is for edibles. So that's any like food items that we can deliver. That's the least natural. So that's something that we try to refrain from. However, if it's very valuable and we're seeing quick results, then that's something that we will utilize upon your permission. The A is for activities. So this is things like going for car rides, going on the swing, going to the park, things like that. Any activity that you would have to engage in. T is for tangible. So that is toys, iPads, anything like tangible or physical that you can give your child. And then the last S is sensory. So squeezes, any fidget type things, playing with shaving cream, any sensory type activities that you would provide for reinforcers. Some kids love sensory toys, some kids do not like them at all. So again, it's a personal preference. So that's why we really specifically try to individualize it for all of our kids. So the next step is to look at how to utilize it. So now that you kind of have an idea of how to identify your reinforcer and some common types of reinforcers, next step is teaching with it. So the first step is looking at the behavior that you're looking to target. So for example, if you're teaching body parts and you want to teach your child to touch your nose, that is the target behavior that we're looking to reinforce. So you want to make sure that your target behavior is specific. Your child knows the expectations. And then making sure that you're prompting if your child doesn't have the skill, so then they can access reinforcement and you're reducing your frustration levels. So you identified your target behavior, you've already done your preference assessment, so you have identified the reinforcer that your child's working for. So if you said, if you laid out your reinforcer, your child chose bubbles, you chose your target behavior, which is touching nose, then you go ahead and provide the instruction. So touch your nose, and then if your child doesn't respond, you follow through with your demand. And if you have to prompt, you can prompt. So your child touches their nose, then you deliver the reinforcer within 1 to 2 seconds, ideally. So you want to make sure that you have your item in your hand before you're teaching the skill so that you can deliver it immediately, contingent on that response. And make sure that you're consistent with what you're reinforcing. So if you're looking for touch your nose, you prompt it, then you deliver the reinforcer contingent on touching their nose. Then we're increasing the correct behavior. So you can imagine, we talked to our techs in their new hire training about the importance of immediate delivery, because so much can happen between your response that you're looking for and reinforcement if a minute goes by. So, your kid could be scratching their head, picking their nose, playing with their ears, crying, peeing in their diaper. There's lots of behaviors that can happen in a minute's time that you could be inadvertently delivering the reinforcer for. So you want to make sure that it's specifically for whatever that target behavior was that you've identified. So when teaching, we utilize what we call a reinforcement schedule. So I won't go too deep into this because there's a lot of terminology and things like that are involved that we utilize in the clinic. But for purposes of teaching at home, one of the things that I just want to touch on is consistency and thinning reinforcement. So identifying a reinforcement schedule helps with establishing expectations, knowing what pacing should look like, providing structure, and increasing the amount of learning opportunities that you're getting for your child. So this is something that we identify that a reinforcer should be delivered contingent on a certain number of responses. So if you're working on teaching your child to touch your nose and touch their head, we want to make sure that reinforcement is delivered exactly the same every time until your child's getting it. So if you're noticing that your child now knows what their nose is and you've been delivering bubbles every single time they touch their nose, now it's time to start to thin reinforcement a little bit. So obviously it's not realistic long term to provide bubbles every single time your child touches their nose. So now we look at systematically thinning that or fading it. So now instead of bubbles every time, now you do it every other time. So we call it a fixed ratio of 2. Now you're delivering reinforcement every second time that they do that. It's also common with toileting. Obviously, you can't deliver reinforcement forever for potty training or every success in the toilet. So you work on systematically thinning that out to where you don't want to completely pull reinforcement, because then your child may regress because we call it natural reinforcement hasn't taken over yet. So you want to start with, okay, now we're going to do every other time. All right, now every third time. And usually we would thin reinforcement every second day of success. So if you're looking at toileting, now your child has not had accidents for 2 days on reinforcing every other time. Now you can probably go on to the next, now every third time on your third day of 2 days of successes. So that's kind of where we utilize a token economy. A lot of you have probably heard that term from me when we're talking about thinning reinforcement. So this is like a sticker chart or earning stars or earning Minnie Mouses to build our way up so they're not getting a sucker every single time they do what we want to see them do. I'm going to briefly touch on this because, again, there's a lot that goes into it. And I really want to talk about the misconceptions of it. A lot of people say, token systems don't work for my child. And that should never be the case, because really a token economy relies on the backup reinforcer, we call it. So it's what they're earning at the end of receiving whatever it is that they're earning. So a lot of people may say, my child just doesn't like stickers. But that's okay. Your child doesn't have to like stickers. It's not the stickers that are supposed to be reinforcing. The stickers are supposed to be learned reinforcers because they're paired with something that's really valuable at the end of earning them. So some reasons that the stickers might not be reinforcing are because either that item that they're earning at the end of earning all their stickers isn't valuable enough, or our reinforcement schedule is too high. So we may have them earning 5 stickers before they get the sucker, but that might not be worth it to them. So every time they see the sticker, they cry. That means that we probably need to start with, all right, 1 sticker equals a sucker. And then we work up to, now 2 stickers equals 1 sucker. That kind of helps build up the child's tolerance and understanding that they have to earn or do 2 things before they get access to the reinforcer that they're earning. And like I said, if that end thing isn't reinforcing or valuable, then I would tweak that, like either give them more candy or choose a different reinforcer that's more valuable to them, that makes it worth it for them, basically, based on, whatever task it is that you're asking them to do. So a token system in a nutshell is just providing tokens or stickers or Mickey Mouses, whatever it is that's motivating for the child, to then work on thinning out your reinforcement schedule. So now your child can earn 5 stars, which means going to the bathroom 5 times before they get that end all be all reinforcer at the end. Some things to consider, like I kind of just mentioned, is the response effort for what you're asking them to do. This is not necessarily just with token systems, but just with reinforcement in general. You want to choose a reinforcer that is worth the task. So if you're asking the child to clean the whole 2,500 square foot house for 1 M&M, it's probably not going to work, because it's probably not going to be worth it to them. If you're giving a whole bag of M&Ms contingent on that, then, maybe we're talking. So that's something to consider when you're choosing your reinforcer, is how much you're giving and how worth it is for the child. And you'll probably be able to gauge that a little bit, like if you're starting to see some challenging behaviors, or if you're just seeing like a really intense lack of motivation to complete the task. That probably means that you don't have an effective reinforcer. The value. So again, I talked about this a little bit, and there is another training on motivating operations. But one thing that we want to focus on is the value of the reinforcer. So kind of going back to the preferred item versus a reinforcer. And again, the difference is whether or not we're actually seeing an increase in the behavior. So if we're not, that means that our reinforcer is not valuable enough, and we either need to look at deprivation or satiation, which, to learn more about those, you can watch the Motivating Operations PowerPoint or video. or we need to change the reinforcer altogether, or change how much we're giving it to them, or how much of it we're giving. So maybe we're giving 1 minute of the iPad, but they really need 3 minutes of the iPad. Those are all things that are important and can be tweaked when teaching and determining your effectiveness of your reinforcer. And an important piece too is looking at preference during that specific time. So like I said before, preference can change so much so quickly, and I might really like bubbles an hour ago, but right now bubbles are just not doing it for me. That's why it's important to reestablish their preference during the time of teaching to make sure that the reinforcer is truly valuable during that time. So those are the biggest things I wanted to talk about. And I also just want to add really quick, another misconception of reinforcement that's pretty common, and that's bribery versus reinforcement. So this is also a common thing that I hear, like, oh, we're bribing our child because we're giving them a sucker. There is a difference between bribery and reinforcement. So I know I gave you examples of all the natural types of reinforcement, but in the scenario of teaching, a sucker may be reinforcing. And the main difference between the two is that in bribery, we are offering the reinforcer before the behavior occurs. I, for one, am guilty. That's like when you're in the grocery store and your kid's screaming and like, here's the sucker, but you need to be quiet the rest of the time we're in the grocery store. That's an example of bribery because I gave the child the sucker before they actually stopped crying. I gave it to them to stop crying. So I gave it to them ahead of time. That's bribery. Reinforcement is laying down the expectations ahead of time, following through with those expectations, and providing the reinforcer after. So in that scenario, what I should have done, which I know is hard, probably I would do something different, but just to kind of get my point across of what the difference is between the two, what I should have said is, all right, we need to have a quiet voice or use nice words or whatever language you want to use for your child for 10 minutes, and then you can have a sucker. I set a timer, show them 10 minutes, follow through. So they need to demonstrate whatever rule it was that I stated and follow that rule for 10 minutes before they can have access to a sucker. So you can see that the expectations are very different, which as a parent, I know that's not realistic, and it's tough. So that's kind of where it goes back to you want to choose a target behavior that's achievable and provide reinforcement for being able to achieve those things. And also, one thing I want to point out, which kind of reminded me with my grocery store example, not only do you want your goal to be achievable, you want it to be able to be to where you can be successful with implementation too. So not only do the expectations help for the child, you also, like in that scenario, I could see myself saying 10 minutes, but like on minute 9, my kid cries and I still give them the reinforcer. Now the expectations are fuzzy, so now it's kind of a bribe because I could see them starting to escalate and I wanted to prevent it from happening. So I just knew in that moment that I couldn't follow through. You have to be mindful of that too when stating expectations because, we kind of talked about being able to follow through with expectations. And if you feel like you can't do that, then I either wouldn't provide it and everything goes out the window. So it prevents you from making the expectations fuzzy, and it also prevents you from causing frustration between you and the child. Because if you're going to teach utilizing reinforcement, you want to make sure that you're consistent with your reinforcement so you build that trust between you and your child. And if the expectations aren't clear, then you're kind of losing that level of trust. So it kind of, then you start to see some increases in challenging behaviors as well. So I think that's it. on reinforcement. I know I mentioned a lot the motivating operations, PowerPoint or video. I feel like that's really relevant to kind of piggyback off this training. And also, there's a brief training on differential reinforcement that will kind of dig a little bit deeper into it, but is also something that you're regularly going to utilize in your teaching. All right, thanks, guys.